Howdy folks, I'm Mark, I make stuff, and today we're diving into part 2 of the Swatchity Code-Along series. What is Swatchity, you ask? Well, rather than repeat a whole bunch of silliness, I'll just recommend that you click on that linky thing in the upper right for some context, and then you can pop back over here. It's okay, I'll wait. It's fine. All caught up? Cool. Let's talk about SW002, otherwise known as Initial Layout and UI. So the story says when a user visits the app, they should see the header, nav, and the main nav footer to match the wireframes. You can see the basic landmarks here. You'll notice that our main navigation is actually below the primary content, and that is on purpose, but we want to do this in a way that is not going to become a problem for accessibility, and we'll get into that. If logged in, they'll see their avatar as a toggle to display the profile menu with links described in the design docs. And if logged in as the admin role, they'll see an admin icon. I eventually changed my mind about this because that's really valuable screen real estate, and it didn't make sense to devote that to an admin icon that is only going to be seen by one person, so it doesn't make sense. The app's primary navigation will appear above the main in the DOM, in the code that is sent to the browser, but it will appear below the main content to match the design docs. And that's kind of what we were talking about. That is an accessibility consideration. So we want to make sure that for people using screen readers, the main nav above the main content and on the screen, we'll be able to see the main nav below the main content. For some pages, there will be a sub-navigation component, and we'll get into that in a minute. And these bits down here are mostly just the technical things that had to be done. And then again, running those ally tests and making sure our test coverage is A-OK. So before we go any further, I want to talk about styling. So let's take a look at our styles directory here. As you already know, there are loads of options for styling in React, and they all have their merits. For example, for a project with loads of customized CSS, I would probably go with Sass modules. For a typical form-driven application, I really like Material UI, aka MUI. For building things fast, though, I love Atomic CSS. In fact, in this case, you can see our globals. Here's what we bring this is what we bring in our app component, and it's basically just bringing these things in. We have the config for the colors, and that config is used in our modules as well. So we have our Sass modules here too, right? So we have a hybrid approach where we have, you can see these spacing pieces here. So we have our Atomic CSS as well as our modules. And I would say in most projects I have worked on, I almost never have just a single method for styling. It's usually a mix of a couple of different approaches. You might have a Material UI theme along with styled components. You might have Sass modules and some inline JavaScript styles. It doesn't matter. It makes sense to pair those options down so that you know where the levers are to make styling changes, right? So if it's all using one method of styling, it's really nice because you know exactly where to go to make those changes. For me though, Sass modules are really great, and I knew that I was going to need a few of them at least. But I didn't want to make a new Sass module for every component I created, because I've done projects like that and it's kind of slow, where most of the time what I'm really doing is I'm just using it for spacing or for, you know, basic layout stuff related to basic flex classes. And that's really all I'm doing. So I would say in the last couple of projects I've been working on, I've been using a lot of Tailwind. I like Tailwind for working quickly because, again, Atomic CSS is a great way to work fast. The only thing I don't like about it, and I think I hear this gripe about Tailwind quite a lot, is that the class lists can get kind of lengthy and hard to read and hard to maintain. I think on a good day, I try to keep my classes in a certain order. But, you know, I should probably document that order or do something to make that more formalized. In this case, though, I made my own Atomic CSS classes because, frankly, it was pretty easy, and that allowed me to have a very small bundle for my CSS. And frankly, I love this kind of stuff, so I didn't mind doing this at all, even though it did take some extra time. I tried to make sure that if I was using something highly customized that was only going to be used once, it really made sense to make a module for it. And right now, at this stage of the game, we only have a couple of modules. We add several more by the time we're done with the project, but we still don't have a ton. So as I said, we have our color config up here. This is sort of the Swatchity color palette right here, right? And then we can just use this wherever we want. We have our breakpoints, which are mix-ins that we can say, you know, include desktop up for the large stuff, for things like the sidebar that only appears in larger screens, that kind of thing. So let's talk about structure and accessibility. And the best way to see the page structure is through the layout component. So the layout component, as you remember from last time, that layout component is being used to wrap all of our page content. So in this case, the page content is very, very simple, just saying like sort of an IOU for content to be added later. You can see that we only have a handful of props. One of them, of course, is our children. We saw this page meta object earlier, and that has its own type, right? It has its page meta type. It's just the title and the meta description, right? So we pass that in. And there's also subnav data. In this example, we do have subnav data, and that comes in from our constants file. And you can see that we have basically just href and label key. And they match the type that we've defined elsewhere for these subnav items. And it just comes in as an array of subnav items. So in the layout here, you can see all of our basic landmarks are present. So in the header menu, you're going to see we have our header, and in the main nav, we have a navigation landmark right there. We can see our main, and that's where the content goes, right? And we can see our footer, and that would just be a footer down there. This sidebar here, this has no real content in it yet. It just says sidebar. We don't actually put content in here until very near the end of the process, when we start talking about news posts and things like that, which we're not ready for that. But that content goes here. This content is supplementary. This only appears for wide screens. That's why we have this this class here called wide column sidebar, right? That under a certain screen size will just go away, and I'll show you what that looks like. So that's what's in here. You'll also see a couple of other items, our page SEO component and skip link. So the skip link here, you can see, is just a very simple link. It is we have some CSS that makes it invisible to the screen, but screen readers will be able to see this content, and it will allow them to skip the navigation, so they don't have to hear the navigation on every page. That's a pretty basic accessibility accommodation. Our page SEO, let's take a look at that. This component gets more complicated over time. If you compare this with the one we have in the live site in the main branch, you'll see we've added some more social media graph tags and that kind of stuff. Later on, I ended up creating a generalized Swatchity image. We add that as a tag in here. When somebody posts a Swatchity link on social media, then that image will appear. We're passing in the title and the meta description. Those get used here. The title gets used here. So those will be available for SEO. That's really all that's for. Let's take a look at the header menu. So the header menu is pretty simple. If you are logged in, meaning if there is a user meta record, we're going to show you the profile menu. The profile menu contains the avatar. We'll go over the avatars in a minute. If you're not, we're going to have a link to signing in with the Next-Auth sign-in function. We're pulling that in from Next-Auth React, right? So once they sign in, they'll see the profile menu. The profile menu has links to edit their own profile, which we'll get into in the very next session. And then we have the Swatchity logo, which has some animation as you hover over the logo, which we'll get into in the demo. And then we have this piece here, which eventually I changed my mind about this. Again, this is very valuable real estate. This is the upper right-hand corner of the screen. And because of the readable F and all kinds of other reasons, this real estate I did not want to waste on an icon that only I would ever see. So this eventually gets replaced with something that we can pass in, something that comes in through the layout that is a list of buttons that can be placed here. And that's where we have refresh the list of swatches, add a new swatch, add a new reply. So the main nav, again, it appears above the main, but you'll see in the demo, it actually, the CSS puts it below the main. So we have our links data, we map through that, and we display that down here. You can see this is a fairly straightforward React thing where we're just using next links to get us to these pages based on the href that is provided in the data. We have more of these classes where this hover zoom, you'll see there are certain places where we use that for clickable, focusable items. We have this hover zoom optional class that will zoom in as you hover over it. This has dot will put a tiny badge on an icon based on whether or not there's something new for you to see here. And we'll get more into that in a later session about actually making that work. Profile menu, if you're logged in, you should only see this if you're logged in, right? We're going to have the avatar based on the user meta. Eventually we change this so that we just pack it with the data that it really needs as opposed to sending the entire user meta record. This button here will open or close the profile menu. And then we have the actual nav element for our profile menu, right? And all of these are formatted messages, which means that these are pulling from our lang packs. In one of our last, and maybe it is the last session, we're going to go over making lang packs, making sure they're all the same, the translation and that sort of thing. So all of that makes sense. But what I find interesting is this avatar thing here. So the avatar, you can see we bring in all the different patterns of the avatar. In the original version of the site, the avatar was made up of 4 colors, but the only pattern was a checkerboard. So everybody's avatar looked almost exactly the same, so it was really boring. So in this version, you only get 3 colors to choose from, but you can choose any of about 33, 34 different patterns. Now, some of those avatar patterns become available as you post more stuff and you level. Remember we talked about the score and the level, the kind of gamification of the site? Well, as your level rises, then you have the ability to choose some of the funkier ones, like the pyramid eye that's kind of a reference to the original site. We bring in the user meta. We have this function here that turns the color values into a hex string. Turns out this actually doesn't work as well as I thought it was. So we bring in all the color components. So the 3 colors, the R, the G, and the B for all 3, plus the pattern. We pack this object with 3 colors based on that function that, again, sort of does what it's supposed to do, but eventually we made that much better. We pass those colors along to the selected pattern based on the avatar pattern, right? So this is all conditionally displayed. And each of these, let's take a look at one of these, and you can see how simple these are. These are just very simple React components. This is all SVG stuff. The great thing about working with SVGs is at the end of the day, it's markup. So you can make them into components. We could animate this if we wanted to. All of these patterns, all 33 of them, 34 of them, they were all made in Inkscape. So I actually made them all in a single file because that was more convenient for me to do it that way. And it also made it really easy for me to compare them one to the other. So I have this guide element up here, this circle, lets me know kind of what is actually going to be seen. And I can, as I go through this, you can see that's an abstract one. I quite like these. I wanted to do more of these. Some checkerboard patterns. That cube pattern is kind of fun. So one of the great things about Inkscape is that it saves everything naturally in SVG. And we can very easily export it as a plain SVG, which won't have the extra Inkscape attributes. We save it as a plain SVG, and then we can go to a tool like this called SVG-to-JSX. So our plain SVG version of our avatar patterns, we just drag it over, and then you can see that it accepts our SVGs, and then it turns it into a component. Now you could do this by hand, it's very easy. But for stuff like this, where I was doing this over and over again, trying to get the look that I wanted, trying to get the proportions that I wanted, it was so much easier to use a tool like this, right? The other thing that I do before I bring it in is I get rid of my height and width elements. I get rid of those. Really what I want to do is set these proportions and then have it fill whatever space I wanted to give it. So that's all these things are, and you can see our fill is color 1, color 2, color 3. Some of these are fairly complicated, where I might have 2 or 3 items that use color 1 and so on. But it's all very simple, right? So let's take a look at pattern circles. I get rid of the height and width here. All we really want is the basic boilerplate, our class name, so we can make sure that we make it full width and full height, and we set a border radius to make it round, and then we have our view box. That's all there is to the avatar. It's actually really simple. But this brings up a really good point. Let's talk about testing. Let's take a look at the icons, for example. So when I'm testing, I don't want to write individual tests for all of my icons, because really all I'm trying to do is make sure that they actually render. One way to do that is to import all my icons. I have many more down the road, but the same pattern applies. We make an array out of those icons. I give them all a label just so we can set our text for the output, right? So we have item label, renders filled icon, renders unfilled icon. And we do the same thing over here for under common avatar. You can see what we do here. It's even simpler. We don't have to bring in all the different patterns, because we're actually going to imply them by using the avatar, and we're going to display each one through a for statement. A lot of our other testing, like button icon, this is very simple. We're basically just making sure that it renders, and we make sure that it reacts to a click, right? But in other elements, we need a lot more information, so we need to mock quite a bit more to get them to work properly. So you can see we have our intel provider wrapping our header menu, because we want to make sure that we're getting internationalized text in this component, right? We're also mocking our user context to make sure that we return, the first time it runs, we return null user meta. The second time it runs, we return null user meta. Every other time after the first two, it will return the actual mock user data. So that's most of the kind of tests that we're doing at this point. They're pretty simple. They get more complex over time. I really enjoy looking at other people's tests or how they would solve this. I sometimes do unit tests for fun because I'm a very nerdy person. Take a look at the ones that are in the main branch, and if you have ways to improve them, let me know, because like all of us, we're all trying to get better and learn better and more efficient ways to do things. So now that we've talked about all that stuff, guess what we're going to do? We're going to do a demo. We don't have a ton going on in the main application currently. This is still only part 2, but it's a great deal more than we had in part 1, right? We had nothing styled in part 1. So things are starting to take shape. None of these pages are currently live. These are pages that we're going to be adding over time. You can see as these icons are kind of zooming in as we hover over them, that's that hover zoom. This hover animation here is part of the logo component. That component got its own module because, as you can see, there's quite a bit of CSS that makes the animation happen, and then we cycle through these colors here. That's just to give it a feeling that it was branded. And over here we have our avatar. And as you can see, we click on it, it has a little bit of a bounce, which I like. So you can see here this profile. This is going to say edit profile eventually. And that is what we're going to be working on in the very next session. So we have that. There's our avatar. You'll notice this actually isn't the correct color. And that's to do with that function I was telling you about. We fixed that eventually. You see that line up there as we clicked on this, we got that dotted line. As I hit my tab button, you can see that it goes down that list and then over there. And then we go down here. It goes down here. Now this style changes to make these more obvious. And I think I rounded these as well. I spent some time on the styling of the focus, and that was why, right? So we have a little bit of an offset, which gives them a little bit more breathing room, which I really liked. So a good example is this one. I wanted round elements to have round focus, and down here, you'll notice they're not round yet. They will eventually be. You see these elements are round, right? So that's where we're heading. We make some edits down the road and some later branches for that, but that's the basic idea. And then we have this big ugly sidebar that has no content in it yet. It'll eventually get content, but as you can see over here, these are elements that we're not ready to work on yet, right? So, and this is also a sticky sidebar, right? So it kind of snaps into position as we scroll up and down. But these are news items, which we don't do until very near the end. And then once we have enough swatches to play with getting top swatches and top swatchers, top users, then we do that. This is a good example too of what the different avatars look like as people make their own. So that's all I've got for this particular user story. I think we hit all the points that were relevant. So next up is profile edit. That's this thing here. And that's going to be really fun. As I talked about, lots of custom components. So I will see you in part 3.